The Rag and Bone Shop by Robert Cormier. So last year I read two books by Robert Cormier, Tunes for Bears to Dance to and After the First Death, the latter of which actually ended up becoming, I think, my second best read of 2023. That book is truly something else. That hits like a train, leaves you reeling and stunned in its wake. Truly a masterpiece of a book, and possibly the greatest of all, at least nominally, YA novels. But after that, Robert Cormier was pretty much on my list somewhere of favorite writers because that book was truly a masterpiece, one of the most visceral and intense things that I have ever read. And after that, I wanted to, read more of his work, continue in my journey through his bibliography. And so that brings us to the subject of this review today, which is this book, The Rag and Bone Shop. Now, this book was the final book which Robert Cormier gave to the world. It was published in 2001, I believe, several months after he died, actually. I think he died in 2000. And so this was technically a posthumous publication, but this was the last book, I guess, that he worked on. And the pretty much, I guess, the last Robert Cormier book that the world was destined to know. And so reading this, I was anxious to see how he went out, whether he went out on top or not, whether he went out on a high note or not. And now, having read The Rag and Bone Shop, I have to say I don't think he did. Unfortunately, it pains me to say this because, After the First Death is just, I mean, that book is seared into my mind. Um, it's just such a masterwork, and because of that book, I hold Cormier in such esteem literarily. But as much as I like Cormier and his work, I have to say this is a far cry from his best. Now, it's not outright bad, and I want to say that up front. This is not a bad book per se, but it's also not terribly good. And again, it is a far cry from his true masterworks like After the First Death or The Chocolate War. Um, so yeah, as much as it pains me to say it, his career may have ended not with a bang but with a whimper. But I'm going to tell you all about this book and tell you why that is. So, The Rag and Bone Shop, the plot of this book is there is a young girl found murdered, like a 7-year-old girl found murdered, and the last person to see her alive was a 12-year-old boy named Jason, and he is the prime suspect in the murder. So, in order to try to get to the bottom of things, the police enlist the help of a renowned cop who is notorious for being an exceptional interrogator and being able to extract confessions from even the most reticent of subjects. So they enlist this cop interrogator named Trent to hammer the boy Jason and get a confession out of him to wrap up this case, because so much for innocent until proven guilty, right? So this book takes the form largely of an interrogation between the detective, the rather unscrupulous detective, and the innocent and kind of wet behind the ears kid who is also kind of introverted and lonely, something of an outcast. As the questions ramp up and the heat is on, and then this leads to some kind of interesting psychological quandaries. And yeah, so that's what this book is about, long and short of it. There's a murder. Young boy is prime suspect, and he is interrogated by a cop who always gets a confession out of his suspect. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Now let's get into why this book doesn't hold up in comparison to Cormier's best works, and that would have to do largely with its length. Cormier, in his later years, pretty much stopped writing full-length novels. He moved to basically like a shorter form kind of novella format. It's like Tunes for Bears to Dance to. That was like barely 100 pages. And this is no exception. This is a very brief read. This edition here, this paperback, it's like 154 pages, but then again, the line spacing is pretty good, and these pages are pretty small, and it is not a long read. I would say that the word count can't possibly be over like 35, 40,000 words tops. I would say it's really not a novel. It's like a novella. And that's a big problem because the page count of this book is insufficient to support the ambitions of the story. And that is a crying shame because this story does have real ambition to it. The actual premise of this story is good. And also, the main theme of the story is just classic Cormier. It's about the destruction of innocence by experience. It's about children having their lives manipulated and ruined by the ambitions and connivances of adults. I mean, just classic Cormier thematic material on display in this book. But like I said, sadly, the brevity of it is such that it cannot uphold what it wants to do, and it really could have benefited from more, just more, like more words, more pages. It needed to be longer than it was. And I said the same thing in my review of Tunes for Bears to Dance to. That book was too short as well, but that book was better than this one because the story was much simpler in that book, and the premise was not particularly high concept. So even though that book could also have benefited from an increase in length, it still skates by better than this book because this book is pretty high concept, and again, it's just too thin. It's too thinly executed. So the characters in this book aren't terribly deep. Jason is the main character. He is a 12-year-old boy who is also, like I said, very introverted and kind of outcast. He doesn't really have many friends, and so he is an object of sympathy, at least, if not empathy, because this 7-year-old girl was like one of his only friends, which is kind of weird. I'll say that, and Cormier notes that in this book. The detective is like, that's pretty odd that a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old are, thick as thieves, right? But anyway, so but beyond that, Cormier tries to give depth, but he goes about it in a not particularly elegant fashion, I don't think, because when you deliver backstory in a book, the optimal way is to, strategically insert it into the narrative, to kind of sprinkle it throughout the story, kind of, not just dump the whole thing all in one go up front. Like Dean Koontz, the author Dean Koontz, does this a lot in his books, where he opens his books in kind of the Star Wars way. The Star Wars movies have opened with the scrolling text that just info dumps the setup of the movie. And Dean Koontz does that a lot, and Robert Cormier unfortunately does quite a bit of that in this book. The detective who is brought in to interrogate the kid, he has a lot of like guilt and kind of self-loathing because his wife died, and he feels like he neglected her, and they were kind of at odds with each other at the time of her death because he's so wrapped up in his job. But then again, that's just, as I said, it's kind of just unloaded upon the introduction of his character. So there's not much. There's not much mystique, and it's just like, oh, here's the backstory. Let's go. And also, it's kind of just tossed off. Like his backstory, it's explained in just like one or two paragraphs, and we're supposed to take that as emotional investment. Doesn't work. And then again, the main kid is serviceable, I guess, but really it's coming from a place more of sympathy than true empathy, I think. So the characters in this are not terribly well developed. But also, let's talk about the problems with the story. So the main gist of the story is this interrogation where this unscrupulous cop is brought in to extract a confession from this young kid because the police in the town are just like, it has to be him. We have nobody else. It has to be him. So let's just wrap this up and screw justice. Let's just get this off the books and get this kid behind bars. So they bring in this detective, right? And so he does it. Like he hammers the kid and like he twists his words. And that actually is one of the stronger portions of the book is the actual extended interrogation scene because like the kid is perplexed as to why he's even being asked all these questions, and like you kind of see the childish naivete, which is his own undoing, and then the detective is like twisting his words for the recording um, to make it sound like he's saying things he's not really sounding, which is pretty deft. Although I have to say that may require some suspension of disbelief here because I mean, can a child, especially a child this young, be interrogated by the police without parental accompaniment or legal counsel, at least? I don't know. I would think probably not. I don't know if any of this would actually hold up in court. But, suspend that disbelief, and it's still pretty compelling in the interrogation as the detective, the adult detective, is basically just tearing down the psyche of this young child, which is pretty, traumatic for the kid. So that's pretty good. But like, so they bring the detective in, and they're like, "We got to get this kid to talk. You gotta just drag it out of him somehow." So he does, and at the very end, spoiler alert, I guess the kid confesses, even though he didn't do it. And that's another aspect of the book that I think could have been done better. Is that we know from the start that he didn't. Um, like we know up front that he's innocent, and I think this could have been such a better book if we didn't know that from the start. Like it would have been so much better if like it had been truly ambiguous as to whether this kid is a killer or not, whether he actually did it or not. And I think you could have pulled that off. Again, it would have taken a much bigger page count, but you could have pulled that off, and it would have been a better book if Cormier had. But anyway, so we know the kid's innocent, but he ends up confessing, and because the detective just hammers him so much. And then the guy walks out and he with the tape, and he's like, "I've got the confession." And then this female cop that he was kind of attracted to is like, but we just got the real confession out of the little girl's brother. It was he that did it. She's like, you made the kid confess. You forced him, you coerced him to confess. And I'm like, bitch, what did you think he was doing? What did you think he was there for? That's what you brought him there to do. You brought him there to hammer the kid, to wring a confession out of him, because you were all convinced that he did it to begin with. Like that was explicitly what you brought him in to do, was just to get the confession, whether it was right or wrong anyway. And then now you're like, you monster. I'm like, that was the whole point. It kind of undercuts itself, I think, at the end. And then there's also this like subplot involving a senator. It tries to do like what Thomas Harris did with the Silence of the Lambs, where like the bad guy, the killer, inadvertently like kidnaps the daughter of the senator, right? So it draws in like this political element which ups the stakes. And Cormier tries to do that in the Rag and Bone Shop by having the grandson of some senator be in the same class as the little girl who got murdered. So now the senator has some kind of investment in this case. Why, I don't know, but he's like, we have to get this solved. He's like, I have to be able to say that we solved this case. And it doesn't work. It's like, okay, like it worked in the Silence of the Lambs, like obviously because Buffalo Bill had the senator's daughter, so that the political element, the higher stakes worked. But in this, the senator breathing down the necks of the cops to get the case solved because his grandson happened to be in the same class as the girl who got killed. It's flimsy. It doesn't make much sense why this has to have some kind of political broader element to it. That didn't really work. And then that brings me to the ending of this book. So Cormier's books do not end happily. That is what made Cormier such a standout in the field of YA literature. Because back in the 70s and 80s, whenever he wrote his true masterworks like The Chocolate War and After the First Death, what made those books stand out is just how brutal they are. It used to be children's literature or literature aimed at younger readers was kind of it was a little rosy, right? I mean, bad things might happen, but the overall messages are tried and true cliches like follow your heart and chase your dreams, and you can do what you imagine and blah blah blah. But that is not what happens in Cormier books. Like in Robert Cormier books, the children are lucky if they even survive, and if they do survive, you can bet they're like irreversibly traumatized for life. And that I knew how this book was going to end roughly. I mean, I knew that was going to be the outcome. I was going to be like, it's going to have some kind of nasty, like leave a bad taste in your mouth kind of ending, because that's how Cormier do, right? But the ending to this book felt cheap. It felt really cheap, and beyond that, it felt contrived and unrealistic. So I won't spoil how the book actually ends. I mean, like literally, like the last couple of pages of the book. Um, I won't spoil how it ends because there is, I guess you could call it something of a twist at the end. But I'll say this: it doesn't pack the same punch, and it doesn't work as well as in After the First Death, because the thing about After the First Death is that ending is ruthless. Like it really is like a punch in the gut when you get to the end of that book. But the beauty of it is that it's such a natural consequence of the story. Like you knew reading the book when you started what the stakes were, and you knew that it always could have ended like that. And so, even though it may not be um, the biggest surprise, it still just hits like a train because of just how unhappy and brutal that ending is. But it works because it fits organically with the story, because it is a logical product of the rules which the story has established. But the Rag and Bone Shop, it tries to go for that Hallmark Cormier feel bad ending, but it doesn't work. It doesn't land so well in this one because it feels contrived, and it feels cheap. It really does. So I won't spoil what happens at the end of this. I'll just say that the interrogation of this young child may have had adverse effects, and um, may have may have led to some dire outcomes. I'll say that. That's all I'll say. But it just doesn't land like it does in the other books. Like the Chocolate War, that also has just a punishing ending, which is unhappy in the utmost. But the Rag and Bone Shop doesn't pack the same punch because it's not as natural, and it does. It feels cheap. So overall, um, that's my complaints with this book are numerous, I guess, but there is some good in it. Cormier was still a great writer, and this reads pretty well, except it reads too quickly. As I've said, it needed more time. It needed more time to breathe. It needed more space and given to these scenes, because these scenes, like, it moves so quickly, and there's almost no description in this book. Like there's no detail regarding scenery and setting. It's all like the whole story just kind of takes place in this nebulous blur, ill-defined, you know, um, setting and stuff. It's not very descriptive, but I will say that Cormier is still a good writer, and the prose in this is more than competent. I'll give it that. But um, the main character, I guess, is passable. but none of the character work in this is what I call particularly elegant. So yeah, my complaints of this book are numerous, but overall, it's not a bad book. The actual premise of the story is quite strong, and it could have been so great had it been done a little bit better and a little bit more. But yeah, it's not a bad book, but it's also not terribly good. So I think to rate The Rag and Bone Shop by Robert Cormier, I'm going to give it a C, just a flat right down the middle C. It's not bad, but it's not really good, and it's a far cry from his better works, like After the First Death and The Chocolate War. Even Tunes for Bears to Dance to was better than this because that book was also, I think, deeper, but yet the brevity of the story was more excusable because the story was more simplistic than this. So yeah, it unfortunately Robert Cormier did not go out on the highest note, I think, with his career. I think he kind of went out not with a bang, but with a whimper. But again, it's not outright bad. It's just a lot of missed opportunity. It could have been done so much better. But anyway, The Rag and Bone Shop by Robert Cormier. Have you read The Rag and Bone Shop? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read The Rag and Bone Shop, I would recommend this only for Cormier completionists. If you've never read a book by Robert Cormier, I would not recommend picking this one up to start with. Again, only for the people who just really love his work and just want to read every word that he wrote. Um, Otherwise, read The Chocolate War, read After the First Death, absolutely. That book is not only, I think, probably the greatest YA, got to put that in quotes because with Cormier, YA, that's a nebulous distinction with Cormier, but the After the First Death may possibly be the greatest YA novel of all time, and really, I think just an underrated gem of 20th century literature, period. So yeah, read those books and maybe pick this up if you just want to, read his entire oeuvre. But otherwise, take it or leave it. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.